Hey, John.
Hey there. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Excited to have you on here today. We'll let some folks trickle in here. Hi, Jennifer. I'm gonna spotlight you and spotlight
No.
me. Let's spotlight. Jennifer, quick question for you. Do you just see myself and John in your Zoom window?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. I use Zoom every day, all day, and sometimes there's these obscure features that I'm still trying to figure out.
You're not the only one, and
Right?
it's good to know I'm not either.
Yeah, we're not alone. You're not alone.
I just had it on mute because I'm at the park, so I don't want to have background noise while you guys are talking in a minute.
Oh, right on. You're good. You're
Yeah.
good. It's super casual. Is this your first time joining us here?
No, I've been to your sessions before. They're good.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. Um, all right, we'll let some folks trickle in here. John, while folks are coming in here, um, you know, I'm, I'm just planning on asking you some questions. What I want to do is focus a little bit on EOS and how
Okay.
that might relate to
Sure.
any insights you might have around the hiring process. Again, all in the spirit of what might be relevant to a job seeker
Yep.
navigating their search. So
Good. And we could take questions if you want to.
yeah, let's do that too. We'll do that as well. Hi, Irene. Um, and I'll post the job board. I keep saying job board. I'll post the question board as well on the chat here. And
If we run long, I'm good too. I have time.
say again.
If we run long, I have time.
Okay, cool. I appreciate that. I usually have the schedule for 30 minutes, but lately I've been going past, and so can you go to the top of the hour if we get that far, if we need be? Okay.
Yep.
Hi, Janelle. Okay. There's the link to the question board there. For folks that are listening, if you can, so with this is kind of new in terms of having a guest in these sessions. So we have a bunch of like residual questions on that question board. If you pop a question to that question board, you can go ahead and make it purple. I did an example there, and that way I can see it much easier. And depending on what sort of the volume of questions we get, we can also probably just put them into the chat as well. I've had situations where there was just so much engagement with the group that everything gets pushed up in the chat, and so the questions would get lost. And sometimes there's just so little engagement. It's like, oh, just put in the chat. So
That
anyway,
didn't work for me.
that
On the event number?
oh, sorry about that typo. It's 9613879. There's an extra three in there.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Hi, Dennis, Jillian.
That worked.
Dennis, good to see you. Um, Hi, Shayna. So feel free, you guys, to hey Irene, to turn your camera on. Hey Shayna, how are you? Good to see you again.
Hello, hi.
We'll give folks a minute or so to kind of drop in here. Hi, Jeffrey.
Hello.
Thanks everyone for joining. Jamie, hello. All right. Well, we can get started. I'll talk slower than I normally talk.
Does that mean I have to speak slow too?
Just as people start trickling in. That way I don't have to repeat myself as much. Um, I think I talk faster when I'm nervous. And so it's part of like I try to cram I try to cram as much I try to share as much as I can in these sessions. So I have a way of like just talking really fast. Anyway, welcome everyone to Coffee with a Recruiter. For those of you that are first timers here, give me a quick hand. Okay, one first timer. Okay. I think most of you folks are coming from the Never Search Alone community. I was a moderator for the community about a year ago, and I moderated two groups. And one thing I found is that a little bit of information goes a long way with respect to the recruiter insight and perspective, and sort of demystifying the recruiting interview hiring process. And so I started this thing, I don't know, back in I want to say March, just doing weekly sort of AMAs. And so ask me anything, right? And so this week is a little bit unique. It's quite unique. In fact, I have a special guest, my friend John Enunciata here, who brings some really interesting insights that I think would be quite valuable to you guys and to this community as job seekers. Because John brings, well, not only is a good friend of mine, but he's also an expert in EOS, which is the Entrepreneurial Operating System. He's an executive coach, and he has more than 20 years of HR experience. And to top that all off, he's also a race car driver, and I have yet to go see him race in 2 weeks, right, John?
Next weekend, yeah. Not
Yeah,
this.
all right, I'm there. I'm so excited to go. So the way we'll structure this today, sort of, I'll kick it off with some questions that'll really sort of tap into John's expertise, not only in HR, but also in his work as an executive coach, but also in his work as an expert and consultant in the entrepreneur operating system, which if some of you folks are not familiar, and John could probably explain this better than I can, it is a framework for entrepreneurs to really focus on the things that really move the needle, that really help the organization gain traction. And so anyway, John could probably talk a little bit more about that. But again, really today is for you guys. Whatever perspective, especially John can provide. I'm happy to talk about some of the recruiter stuff as well. But we might want to save that for our typical Thursdays. I think today is really about picking John's brain about his perspectives and insights that might help you position yourself and help you navigate your search much more effectively. So I have a few questions that I'd like to sort of kick us off with. Feel free to drop your questions in the question board. And again, I'll paste this in the chat. And if you could make the question purple. Otherwise, you could just drop it into the chat box there. And all right, well, why don't we kick this off? We'll see how long we go, maybe just past the half hour. If there's a lot of energy, a lot of engagement, a lot of questions, we'll keep it going, but we'll probably hard stop at the top of the hour. All right. Okay, John, that was a bit of a mouthful. I don't know if you want to give a quick introduction on yourself, anything that I might have missed.
No, well, thanks for inviting me. So the way this developed is I jumped on a couple of these calls with Eric, and I just listened to a lot of the questions that were coming up, and I thought, maybe I could help out a bit. I actually have more than 20 years. Hopefully I don't look that old, but I have more than 20 years in HR and through my whole career. And I know a lot of questions were about like what happens internally. Eric can provide a lot of, and it does, a lot of great perspective of when he works with employers on the recruiting process. I thought maybe I can give you some perspective on what happens on the inside from an HR perspective and answer any questions you have about that. Then if you had any questions about EOS, I'd love to help with that. I mean, my career goes back 30 plus years. I've worked in both actually small and big companies, started with a large company that grew quite a bit, moved around from the HR space to technical specialist roles to generalist roles, business partner, and most recently finished up stopped about 6 months ago to become an EOS implementer with a small company here in Salt Lake. So I've seen both large and small companies, the way that they operate from that perspective. And part of what I did in that last company here in Salt Lake was put the Entrepreneurial Operating System in on its 3 divisions, which is a little bit different from an HR perspective, but a lot of business principles in there, helping entrepreneurs and small companies scale, put more process and alignment in their organizations. So that's what I've been doing recently.
Awesome. Well, welcome, John. So just
Thanks.
want to dive right in here with just hitting up questions. Again, I'll drop this in. I'll drop the question board link into the chat box here. So feel free to drop any questions you guys might have. But John, why don't we just start off with learning a little bit more about, what are some of the behind the scenes sort of myths or maybe misconceptions with respect to the hiring process that you've seen from an HR perspective that maybe most job seekers are not aware of, that, if they knew, it might help them navigate the search or process much more effectively.
Yeah. So I guess the first comment or insight I'll give you is it's different in every single organization. I mean, you can interview in 100 different organizations and find 100 different ways that the recruitment process works, the level of organization, the level of discipline, the roles of the recruiter, the internal manager, the process, how organized it is, or how disorganized it is. So I know, and I listened to a couple of the comments and questions about frustrations about that. And I listen, I was in a job search for over a year and a half myself. So I have that perspective of what it's like to go through that process. I guess my only advice I can give you there is hard as it is, easy to say, but hard to probably accept, is don't take it personally, because a lot of the things that happen in a job search are pretty much out of your control on the way that it happens. And, as you encounter new searches, they're all going to be different. Every recruiter handles it different. Even the relationship with the internal recruiter and the hiring manager could differ department by department. And so there's a lot of dynamics behind the scenes that I think my advice is, if you try to beat yourself up on trying to figure it out and why is this happening to me? A lot of times it really isn't you. It's just a reflection of the way things work behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Hopefully it helps a little bit.
One thing that I've seen is there's just a lot of different ways to hire. And I think a lot of assumptions that some job seekers make is that the process is really quite refined and that there's always a method to the madness. Sometimes it's just madness. Like
Yeah.
they don't know what they're doing with respect to hiring, or even interviewers may project themselves as knowing what they're doing with respect to interviewing.
Yeah.
So you might, as an interviewer, or as a candidate, you might be getting some strange off the wall questions, and you might think that there's some method to the madness. Some portion of the time, maybe more often than not, it's just madness.
Yeah.
So don't beat yourself with trying to, reverse engineer what's going on.
Yeah. You know what? There's a couple of different searches that I've handled a lot of different searches internally, and they vary very much on the way that what's happening internally. Some will be, there's a replacement for somebody who's left. I have absolute need. I want to fill the same job with the same level of person that I had before, and I need it right away because I'm short-staffed or I have to get it done. Those are probably the searches that you find move very quickly and efficiently because there's a burning need inside. Then I've done searches where there's a person who leaves, but they're not sure that it was the role. When they want to replace them, do I want to go maybe a little bit senior? Do I want to go a little bit more junior? Do I want to add more responsibility? That's almost sort of like, let's test the market. Give me a wide variety of different types of candidates and experience so that I can sample what's in the marketplace. And that helps me refine my thoughts about what do I really need, as I replace this from that perspective. Then a lot of times there might not be alignment between the hiring manager and their boss on exactly what they need, when they need it, and at what level. Or they may be contemplating some organizational changes so that they may give you different types of profiles, or give me someone who's got a little bit of this, or someone has a little bit more of this type of experience. Let me just see what's out there. And as I start to meet with more people, I will, get a better sense of, my needs from that perspective. I've also had people who have opened up jobs, and all of a sudden they met with some people in the marketplace and said, you know what, I think I need to change the profile. the people that I'm seeing aren't necessarily the skills that I want. Show me more of these types of people. And that's maybe gives you a little bit better perspective of when you start the interviewing process, either it slows down, you don't get great communication on what's happening, or there isn't clarity of why is it moving as faster. A lot of the times it's what's happening behind the scenes, that all of these things are happening. I used to like to be really transparent about that, but some companies have trouble saying, you know what, it's hard to admit we don't have our act together and know exactly what we want to candidates as you're going through the process. So a lot of them just kind of like fall back on not communicating and making it clear on what's happening from that perspective.
Yeah. I see hand raised, Jeffrey.
I was just going to say, I've been on a hiring panel where, we got in a set of candidates and I reviewed them and I gave feedback back to my recruiter. Yeah, we're missing the mark. So, really understand what you're saying there, John.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's hard for them to articulate that. I mean, I think there's two aspects of it. You have to remember that a good recruiter or a good hiring manager is going to look at two things. There's skill set and there's chemistry and culture fit. A lot of times it's hard to articulate that second part of, and I guess the analogy I could say, sometimes it's like it clicks. Now, why did it click? That's really hard to, define or give a candidate feedback on why did it not kind of hit it off? Like when you meet sort of a stranger and you get into a conversation and all of a sudden you get into that rhythm where it's really smooth and, you make that connection. It's not that much different in an interviewing process. And, we have a defined culture we're trying to hire from, but a lot of it is, it just starts to, you know, click. You get that sort of connection with somebody. That also plays a big part into it because I've heard people say, well, you know what? I checked all the boxes. I have all the experience. Why didn't I get this? Some of it could be just the culture fit and sort of that, connection.
What has been your observations or experience, John, with respect to like companies maybe over-indexing on chemistry or culture fit? It's like, yeah, I got into the interview with the person, felt so good about it. He's the kind of person I could go hang out with in my spare time.
Yeah,
Let's hire them, right? Like,
yeah.
what have your observations been? And is it something you've had to work with in terms of like, maybe putting mechanisms in place so people don't over-index on that?
Yeah, you know what? I mean, the success of a relationship, a, a lot of times we used to over-index on the fit because to me, that's a gauge of whether the relationship's really going to work. And sometimes I try to convince managers of, listen, maybe you want to overlook some of those technical things that you're looking for, but if you feel like it's the right fit in your organization, you can work well together. A lot of times that solves 90% of the problems that you have. And you run the risk of it not, being the right chemistry in the long term. And the worst thing you want from a recruiter is making a bad hire. I mean, you waste time of not only the person, somebody ends up either quitting their job or passes over jobs they could have had. So you try to do everything you can to make sure you check all the boxes and reduce the risk before you hire. And I think that a lot of time is the reason why it takes so long. It's because you want to see enough candidates to make sure that you've seen enough that I know what the market is. We've seen everyone we think we would end up hiring and making sure that that's successful.
John, what role have you seen HR play in terms of um either coaching or guiding hiring managers and hiring teams? Um, I'm just curious about what you've seen there.
Yeah, it all depends. The relationship of the role that HR plays in different organizations are very different. A lot of time it's more of the administrative process and the recruiter's role is just get me resumes and I'll do all the decision making. I'll tell you which ones I want. And sometimes they don't even get feedback on why. You just get a stack of resumes of 5 resumes back, schedule these for me. So the recruiter sometimes almost becomes like a processor, a scheduler. Others will know managers well enough to see what they are looking for. They understand what's happening in the organization. They understood the person who left, the skills that they're looking for, what are the issues in the department that they're having. And they can be much better at sort of being faster about making decisions of what, who do we need? What's the right fit? Where is that organization? What's the right profile? So it varies. I mean, the good ones are the ones that I've explained more. You probably see that more at the senior levels than you do at the junior levels. A lot of time, the junior recruiter is pretty much just gathering resumes and sending them and sort of just doing that sorting of the ones that are obviously not fit and ones that are close. And then generally they'll get some back. I mean, in the
Yeah.
perfect scenario, a recruiter who has a great relationship with a hiring manager knows enough that they could probably do the pre-selection and get it down to 2 or 3 people and just present them forward. I think the other thing is that when it takes time as a recruiter, you don't want to start to eliminate people who are possible candidates, because once you get a rejection and somebody says no, it's hard to go back and say, whoops, I made a mistake. I'd really like to re-engage you after I told you you weren't a fit. Would you like to come back and talk to us?
Yeah.
So there are times where recruiters will wait almost to the very end where I'm almost absolutely sure I have 1 or 2 candidates that we're going to hire before you get a no. And I know a lot of your frustrations that you articulated was, well, why does it take so long? That's part of it. Trying to organize schedules with busy people and get, interviews scheduled also becomes a challenge too.
Yeah. That's a good point what you're making about, in any given pipeline or candidate pipeline or cohort, there's a distribution of the types of folks in that pipeline. And uh, sometimes the hiring managers or the hiring teams don't have it's not precise in terms of what they're looking for yet. And maybe the recruiter hasn't figured that out. So
Yeah,
for the recruiter to kind of rule folks out, they 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 typically tend to err on the side of let's just keep them in until I get a better read on what the hiring team is looking for, because they don't want to rule somebody out prematurely. Because like you said, John, it's hard for them to go back and be like, oh, just kidding. We actually do want to talk with you, and by then, the candidate was like, you guys already rejected me and I kind of moved on, so that could be a contributing factor to why it's taking, presumably longer than it might be. And you can ask these questions to try to get a read on, the sort of where they are with the hiring. You could ask them questions like, you know, how long has this position been open,
yeah,
and things like that. So,
yeah. You know what? So I'm glad you brought that up because I heard a couple of people bring that up in previous calls.
mhm,
I personally don't think there's anything wrong with going to a recruiter and saying, can you give me a sense of what's this process look like? How many steps are there? How many people would we end up meeting? Can you give me a sense of what's the urgency of hiring this role? All those things I think are legitimate questions. I think sometimes recruiters forget that they should explain that to candidates
yeah,
as going through it if they have a clear picture of it. I mean, the
yeah,
other thing too is the confidence of the hiring manager has a lot to do with how quickly it moves. I've had some hiring managers that are hard, they don't make decisions easily and they want to see as many candidates so they feel like they've gone, even when they have somebody that they really like. It's like, well, just I want to see a couple more people just to make sure I'm clear. Or I've had some to say, listen, me, send me your top 3. And if I don't, like them, I'll ask you to bring me some more candidates. So that kind of influences the process too.
yeah. So I would imagine there's there's a distribution of the size of companies that, some of our audience members here are interviewing with. How does the relationship and the role of HR vary across the size of the company? So given, let's say an early stage startup versus a much more mature company, and how might that guide how a candidate or a job seeker might prioritize how much they network or try to connect with folks in HR versus recruiting, um, versus like a hiring manager?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the reality of it is HR is an overhead. So smaller companies don't always have the resources or put the money, in my opinion, they should on the HR, function. So I'm going to generalize, but when you work with smaller companies, you're probably looking at a more inexperienced HR person. So I think you would almost expect some of the things that I talked about when you're discussing with, smaller companies, or the HR or the hiring manager actually may run the whole process. I mean, they may post the job, they may end up, because that person may just do administrative things like benefits and, payroll and things of that nature. So I would say, if I'm going to generalize, smaller companies expect probably less coordination and at least less refinement in the whole process. As you get bigger, you start to see a little bit more of that because you can get a more seasoned person, and you probably see more seasoned managers in bigger companies too, because obviously it scales bigger, you can afford to higher salaries and need to have more experienced people too from that perspective.
Yeah. So, as folks are trying to network their way in, I talk a lot about like, yes, apply, but also try to connect with the right folks internally. And generally, I've categorized those folks as recruiters, internal recruiters,
Mm.
or external recruiters, HR folks, or hiring managers. Um, with respect to sort of trying to network with hiring managers, oh, sorry, not hiring manager, HR folks, like any thoughts about sort of their mindset or their incentives um, that might be helpful as a candidate that's trying to reach out and
Yeah,
connect with some of
yeah,
these HR folks. And are
yeah.
there different types of HR folks? I think you kind of alluded to this earlier with, like maybe somebody that's a little bit more administrative or compliance oriented
Yeah,
versus
yeah.
something else.
Yeah, well, there definitely are. Let me pick up on a point that you brought. If you want my opinion or some advice, network as much as you can. I mean, listen, there's a place to apply for jobs that are posted, but there's a lot of unseen jobs that are out there on networking, and you just never know who you're going to run into. Or try to use your network as much as possible. Try to go to as many events as you can. Try to meet with as many people who aren't necessarily in a job search that you can. And that's where you start to make connections. I will tell you, when I had a job come up, and listen, if I had three different candidates and they all look pretty similar, but somebody within the company brought it to me and put it on my desk, it generally got to the top of the stack because that person knew of that person either personally or professionally, either worked with them before. And that started to reduce the risk that I could hire someone that completely turned out different in the way that the interview was. So if you can use LinkedIn or somebody who knows somebody in the company that you're hiring, work on that. I mean, that's where a lot of the effort I think you should do as much as you can and meet hiring, or it doesn't even have to be a hiring manager, but if there's a targeted company that has a job open and you know somebody who works there that may not be in the department, try to use that as a way to get in or at least get your resume in front of the right person. That helps a lot from that perspective.
'Cause even if you're networking or you're establishing some sort of connection with a non-hiring manager, non-HR, non-recruiter, they can still help. What you're suggesting is that they can still help you navigate and get your resume to the right
Yeah.
person.
Yeah. And definitely through like associations or in your function. I mean, if they have groups there that are networking that get together, associations like HR has the, SHRM group, go to those as much as you can because you can connect with people that may know of something that's coming up or knows somebody who knows somebody. And they get to know you as a person and make that connection. So it's not just a piece of paper that I'm looking at. You're making a personal connection with them. And then a lot of times they're more willing to help you out, or you could always lead with, I'm looking for a job, but is there anything that I can help you with? Or, reciprocate. There's a lot of goodwill that gets created that way too.
John, in your experience, what visibility do most HR folks have in terms of like the hiring roadmap, right? And how would that compare relative to like maybe a recruiter or a hiring manager or whatnot, or even a finance person, right? Like,
Yeah.
who are the folks that have most visibility or maybe the earliest visibility in terms of sort of the hiring roadmap and plans?
Again, it's one of those depends. I mean, like,
Yeah.
you can go all the way and be really, really strategic, where we used to look out a couple of years in advance of where we thought the organization was going to be and what type of roles we needed, who could we develop internally, and who might we have to go to the outside to hire. I mean, to me, that's sort of a high level, strategic thinking about recruitment and talent. Um, I would say that's probably the exception rather than the rule. A lot of it's sort of at budget time. Either it's a replacement or you're getting close to the beginning of the new fiscal year. And then I've, authorized 4 different jobs for these, departments in your budget. And that's when recruiting starts to pick up again, where a lot of changes happen.
Yeah.
Um, you end up seeing it also when companies pay bonuses or get raises. Somebody who's been really unhappy waits until, you get your bonus. And then all of a sudden you see this spike in turnover from that perspective. So those are some of the things that influence the internal side.
Is that usually, I guess it depends, but is that usually January-ish,
It
February-ish?
could be sort of that January, February when they close the fiscal year, or
Yeah.
if your fiscal year is a calendar year.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. Like a lot of folks will hold on to their positions until they secure that bonus, and then they'll start, popping their head up and looking around.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk a little bit about, if you think about your executive coaching and, some of the, I guess, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see with your clients and, what advice do you offer them in terms of, positioning themselves to manage their career and their search more effectively?
Yeah. I guess the biggest or coaching tip that I give people who manage people is to be honest. I think a lot of managers, even to the recruitment process, think this is the way that, quote, a manager is supposed to do it. A lot of coaching I have for them is the relationship that you have with someone who's on your team or some of your interviewers, just be clear. Just don't worry less about sort of quote what a manager is supposed to do. Let them know exactly where you stand, what your feelings are about their performance, the way that they work, your relationship with them. Because anything less than that's just not fair, not only to yourself, but them from that perspective. So probably seems a little simplistic, but I mean, that was sort of my biggest coaching advice is don't overthink sort of that managerial technique of what you're supposed to doing. Yes, there's a lot of risk from a compliance standpoint, but for the most part, you're going to get more back if you just sort of be yourself and have open and honest conversations.
Yeah. How often, how often have you seen sort of HR being part of the typical interview process? And how should interview candidates think about that interview with an HR person?
Yeah, it really depends on the HR person. I mean, I think it's generally a first screen. So what they really want to do as quickly as possible is do some of the things that align in your resume, check what I'm looking for or what the manager told me I need, right? So
Hmm.
it should generally go pretty quickly. Depending on the HR person, they may do that culture fit. They may know the manager well enough to see this is the type of style that would work best from that perspective. So you'll probably find that most on the front end from a recruiting standpoint from an HR person.
Yeah. So maybe as a maybe similar to a recruiter screen, an internal recruiter screening.
Yeah. I mean, a lot
Um,
of times that would be through video and pretty
yeah.
short, like a 30-minute meeting. They may then reduce the pool, come back and do a longer interview to get a little bit more in depth or start to move to the next, phase of the manager. I would say too, you'll find every company is different on how many people they meet with, how often, when they come back.
Yeah.
Depends a lot on the culture, sometimes the level too,
Yeah.
the perspective.
So in your experience with hiring and in HR, have you seen any trends with respect, over the 10, 20 years that you've been working in HR? Have you seen any trends in terms of how companies are hiring, and if there's any, um, yeah, any patterns that you've seen, maybe fads or even, sort of passing trends?
No, I'd love to say that there's been trends, I think the cultural fit or sort of using some testing has probably come in a little bit more. And that depends on the company too. I've seen a lot that a lot of people, because the interviewing process is not scientific, they want to use, personality tests or aptitude tests and things to have sort of more data or quantitative things to help them with their decision. Um, it depends on the company and the hiring manager. That's probably one that I've seen a little bit more. Um, and there's 100 different tests that they can use and what they're
Yeah,
measuring and how to do that too.
yeah. It's interesting. I don't know where I got this question. Maybe I don't think it was in the coffee sessions, but it was a question about introducing hurdles slash assessments and whether that's really about minimizing, whether that's about screening people out, or I don't know what the inverse of that would be,
Yeah,
identifying the top folks,
yeah,
right? And I think a lot of times, for what it's worth, a lot of times companies are just, especially when they get inundated, they're just thinking, okay, let's just make them jump through more hoops, and that
yeah,
could be super frustrating.
yeah,
Yeah, for what that's worth, it's not always about identifying the top folks by some of these assessments.
yeah,
It's just, will somebody do the assessment?
right,
And already the people that won't do it are less committed, they're less focused.
yeah.
So great, I'm going from 100 applicants to 50 or whatever, right?
Yeah, and ideally, I mean, I've always looked at it as it's just another piece of data.
Yeah,
You shouldn't really depend anything on, making a decision solely on the outcome of the test. I've always told candidates, if you have a test, be honest. Don't try to figure out what the test is asking for or what the manager wants. It's always better just to do the test, honestly answer it the way you would, because that helps complement or supplement either what they know already, or it helps a lot of time in the recruitment, just say, okay, listen, the test is my gut tells me this about this candidate. And if the test comes in that way, then all of a sudden things start to line up. And then
yeah,
it makes you have a little bit more confidence when you're
yeah,
making a decision that way. Because if you
yeah,
get, I've gotten tests where it's completely different than the assumption I made on the candidate. And a lot of times when I start talking about it, it's like, well, I'm trying to figure out how to answer the questions correctly on the test. I wouldn't recommend doing that. Just, answer it the way it is. And a
yeah.
lot of them have safeguards in the test themselves already. So it kind of ferrets out when someone's trying to, game the test, I should say.
Yeah, these assessments are interesting because, like you said, they add, using that metaphor of like a puzzle piece or a picture, like it adds more color, more resolution to the picture. But one way that we've used these assessments, similar to what you're saying, is if everything looks consistent, great, nothing too interesting. But it's where you start seeing inconsistencies that it's like, okay, we need to explore this further,
Going on.
right?
Yeah.
And so what does that mean for you as somebody that's looking for their next opportunities, being put through these things? Is um, yeah, I wouldn't try to game it. Just try to be consistent, right? It was funny. Just a side anecdote. I was interviewing this guy 2 weeks ago, and I asked him like, when did you last uh when did you leave your last company? And then he was shuffling around in the papers really to look up because he presumably, I assume that he was making stuff up, so he had to be consistent in what he said, but he
Right.
forgot.
Right.
And so he had to look it up on his paper. Oh yeah, I left whatever, July 2024.
Yeah.
And it was like, you left 2 months ago and you can't remember that? And so yeah, so just be careful, right? Make sure everything's consistent. You have a consistent story.
And
Anyway,
when I did recruiting, it actually, I think it came up on last week's call. I've always appreciated people who are their natural personality, or not try to be something different in an interview than what they're really at. I mean, because
yeah,
generally that's who you are once you join the company. And I guess my advice from that perspective is unless you plan on changing your personality to whoever you presented yourself as an interview, eventually your personality and the way that you work and all of these things that you talk about in an interview are going to come out eventually. So I've always appreciated just people who are, represent what they did really well in their career, either challenges they had or gaps or mistakes that they made, in the job itself or, picking the wrong job. It just felt, there was a higher level of comfort when I felt somebody was being sort of themselves and truthful about their backgrounds and things of that nature. I
Yeah.
mean, that's me,
No,
but
I would agree. That's very similar to sort of my approach because if everything is too polished and too perfect, it raises my suspicion of like either what am I missing or what are they obscuring or hiding,
yeah,
But if they let out a little bit of their sort of personality or their quirks,
yeah,
or, at best, their mistakes that they've learned from,
yeah,
then it makes me feel like they're more human, like they're authentic, and I'm seeing
yeah.
sort of, the full picture. But if everything is too polished, too perfect, too even scripted, I get a little bit like, okay, what am I missing here? You know?
It's funny you say that. So one of the CEOs that I worked with in my last job, his biggest question, or he would emphasize and make it dramatic, is tell me about your biggest mistake in your career, or tell me the biggest thing you ever did that went wrong. And the what was we weren't looking for why the mistake happened. What we were looking for is the person's answer about, well, what did you do about it? Or what did you learn from it? Because his philosophy, and I agreed a lot with this, is we're all, nobody's perfect. Everyone makes mistakes, but the better performers are self-reflective about what happened, why it happened, and what did they learn from it, and what did they do going forward. So maybe you also want to bring in, if there's an interview, you can talk about things of, here's a problem that I encountered, here's the things that went wrong with it, but this is what I learned, this is what I came away, and this is why I'm better for it, having experienced that. We used to put a lot of weight in it in that one company, or I do too, when I interview from that perspective. I think showing some
Yeah.
introspection of your career and your job and what you've accomplished helps a lot too.
And just to build on that for a second, John, because when I think most folks, when they're preparing for an interview, when they're, polishing up or adding to their resume, they're thinking about, really accomplishments, right? And usually an accomplishment is something that people think of as, I was successful in that. I tried to reach for this goal and I
Yeah.
accomplished it. There were challenges, blah, blah, blah. So there, a lot of times they're in that mindset. But to your point, collect a few stories about some of the big failures, right? As long as you genuinely can tell a great story about what you learned from it, what you took away from it. And some of these things are opportunities to signal your ability to be proactive. To your point, John, to be the ability to be sort of self-reflective, to be
Yeah.
humble, to learn from it, and to grow from it, right? And that's definitely something that I look for in folks that I want to work with and folks that a lot of my clients want to work with. And so maybe just a thought, having those failure stories, not
Yeah.
just the success, not just the accomplishment stories, but also some of the stories where things just they really did go awry. They just went off the rails. What big
Yeah.
questions? What did you do? What did you do
Yeah,
about it?
so you bring that up too. And so whatever you have in your resume, I would make sure it's what you've actually done. And I will tell you from an interviewing process, the one thing that I was a really big red flag or frustration is the always, well, we did this, we did that. Really, what I want to know in an interview is what did you do? Now, you may have been part of a team and you may not have had done everything from it, but I get more out of saying I did this and I was part of a team and this was my role within the team because it would probably be appropriate based on your level anyway. So, the one thing that I've always found is I'd rather, and I've had to in interviews say, well, that's nice, but I don't want to really know what the team did. I really want to know what you did and what did you accomplish in that. And so, we always had this sort of advice. We use STAR. I don't know if people have heard about that. So what's the situation? What was the task? What was your activity and what were the results? Think about that as a way to describe what you did is here's the situation. This is the task or what the activity was that I had, and here was the result. even if a good recruiter doesn't ask the question that way, it's always better to articulate that in that type of format when you interview. So there's
Yeah,
a piece of advice too.
totally. I love that. And just to add to that, actually use the word. So the situation was, the task was, and what I did, the action that I took, or the activity that I engaged in, the result was because just those trigger words, those key words, it helps the recruiters or the, just any person's memory, right? And so if you help guide them through there, just using those key words, it's really helpful.
Yeah, because there's less follow-up questions. I mean, basically, you've been clear, unless something that they want to dig a little bit deeper. Oh, tell me a little bit more about, that situation, or you know, you've kind of answered anything they could possibly want to know just by making a statement, and that way you get to cover a lot more in the interview too, because you're not having to answer a lot of follow-up questions too.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you can think about that.
So can I shift gears really quick to EOS?
Yeah,
I'm still learning about this. Maybe you can give a brief description of what this is.
yeah,
But one thing that's fascinating about it is that it's a really distilled, action-oriented framework. It's not all ivory tower MBA, right? It's very practical, kind of guidance for leaders and organizations to really get their organization on the right track.
yeah.
And I would imagine, and again, you could talk about this, John, is like how what lessons can be learned from that with respect to the people portion, the hiring portion for those leaders, and what is the mindset that EOS kind of prescribes for these people that are making decisions about hiring? Because
Sure.
I think that insight could help job seekers sort of understand that whether they're using whether companies are using EOS or not,
Yeah,
having some perspective on that mindset, that distilled mindset about how they go after people, how they think about hiring, how they think about
yeah.
structuring their organizations. I think it'd be really relevant. So maybe you kind of expand on that a little bit.
Sure, sure. So I got exposed to EOS, the company, before I became an implementer. So we implemented EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System. It's a very simple, basic business process that you implement. And what we do is we take the owner, the founder, or whoever's in charge of the company, and we take their vision and we align their teams around that vision, and making sure that everybody understands where we're going and how we're going to get there. Then what we do is set up a process to increase the accountability and clarity on responsibility of who's going to do what and when, and how to execute against that vision. And then as a result, you really have higher functioning teams that work better together, more cohesive, and bring a better leadership skills together from the teams themselves. And that's sort of in a very simplistic way of describing what it is. It's not a software. It's not, anything more than just facilitating learning some very simple tools to be able to execute against a vision from that perspective.
And what changes have you seen in the mindset of leaders in terms of how they think about building teams, scaling their organization,
Yeah,
hiring the right folks? Like, have you
yeah,
what changes in their mindset or approach have you seen as a function of implementing EOS at some of these companies?
yeah. So one of the most important tools that helps with that is we call it an accountability chart. What we do is we focus on if you see it, you say, okay, well, that's an org chart. Well, the difference is that we have the main focus on accountability. It's based on function, not on title, and it has a lot of clarity on what is the role and what's the responsibility for the role, because that becomes the launching pad. As when you start to put accountability and responsibility, you always go back to the accountability chart, because that's the clarity on who's responsible for it, right? So there's no question about whether it's, your job or my job. You're accountable for it. And there's lots of tools as you go through creating goals and making sure, you problem solve. There's always the accountability part that goes back to um, the accountability chart from that perspective. So that should bring a lot more clarity on exactly, who's accountable from that perspective.
John, you're probably biased, but would you argue that folks that have companies that have organizations that have implemented EOS are much more focused and not focused and effective in terms of hiring because they have a clear understanding of what they're looking for.
Yeah, it brings that clarity around it where it's not about sort of, okay, I'm hiring for this title. It's more of, let's talk about the key roles that they're responsible for. So yes, I mean, you have much more clarity even within the organization when you bring a role in of how is it different from other part of the organization. So
Yeah, could be an interesting question as
yeah.
folks out there interviewing,
So
if they're, if they've, if they've used the EOS or they've integrated or adopted it.
yeah,
Um,
so Jeff, I have a question on RACI. So there's an aspect in EOS that's similar to a RACI because you're talking about accountability for a project or a goal, but it basically is more of a comprehensive system that goes all the way through of goal setting and accomplishment is just one aspect of it. It brings you through vision, organization, accountability, and then an ongoing process to make sure you keep that going. So it's a good point. It is similar to a RACI as one aspect when you create goals. And I forgot what the acronym for RACI is. I know what it is. So it's been a while since I did it.
we have a few,
Responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed.
Yeah, yeah. I
And
mean, which
then
is
you
great.
have it was a matrix with a bunch of roles. We did it
Yeah,
in waterfall
yeah.
projects a lot.
I would think almost if you think about EOS, it boils it down to as simple as it can because it's always a small organization that's growing really quickly. I use RACI in a really big organization where you have more complexity, more people. It's probably more appropriate. So you can think about what we use in EOS as a very simplified, dumbed down version of RACI when you use it.
so we have a few questions on the question board. I appreciate folks dropping those in there as well. So one question here is, this person wanted to, who asked this question? If you want to raise your hand or just speak up. Oh, awesome. Okay. So Liza, do you want to go ahead and state your
Yeah,
question?
so I mean, it's a kind of vague, well, not intentionally, but question. That's why I wanted to speak. Is that because on the one hand, I hear you saying early on is that there's a lot of hiring managers and HR recruiters want to see a lot of people because they don't have like full clarity, right? What they want, what like how like matches the market, right? And that's kind of like gels. So they need to like see a bunch of people. On the other hand, we often get, and you also kind of voice some of the advice is that network so that there is like roles that are unpublished and not even necessarily formulated, but like you meet the right person, they'll be like, oh, I need exactly like somebody like you for a role on my team. And then like you basically not competing against anybody, right? Like they just in a way like slot you in. And so kind of like how in this like world that they don't really know kind of in some ways or don't fully understand what they want, and then you need to communicate your value like for the role that's not even published, kind of what's the role between in the end like hard skill and soft skills, and how do you talk about explaining who you are, what value you bring to organization? Because especially in the world that we're now in with like AI and everything else, because in my experience at the end of the day as a hiring manager, otherwise it's the soft skills that makes all the difference, right? Like, ultimately. Well, I guess it depends on the role, like, but it's hard to sometimes communicate them or even maybe like figure like, kind of test for them during the interview process. So like
Yeah.
I'm not sure if the question is clear enough or
No, I think the question is clear. I don't know if I can give you a clear answer.
like, right, like what is the kind of like your perspective on that would be helpful.
It really depends on the company and who you're interviewing, the situation. I guess what I try to articulate earlier is you're going to encounter so many different types of roles and type of recruitment process. And it really depends on the company culture, what they're looking for, the type of roles. So it's hard to give you a really good answer on that because it's really going to depend. I mean, also the nature of the job too. I mean, I don't want to over characterize certain roles, but in a real tech job, obviously the hard skills are going to be really, really important from that perspective. But if you're in an influencing role, either internally or externally, maybe the soft skills might have more of an influence. But I hate to say it, when, a lot's going to depend, company, role, situation.
Yeah.
I would say one thing that maybe you brought up too, is I'd also recommend coming up with your 1 minute elevator pitch.
Mhm.
Who am I? What do I do? And what's my value? It's really good to try to get that very concise and work on that. And maybe you want to Google or do AI on how do I develop an elevator pitch. But it's always nice to meet someone who's very clear and concise, that they can represent who they are, what their skills are, and what value they bring, is a good way to start that introduction. So I would recommend highly that you think about that too, because it also shows that you're really prepared to have that discussion. Or when you meet someone in networking, when you talk about, oh, so what do you do? To have that practice too, that it kind of rolls off your tongue and works. So when I do a lot of the executive coaching, we emphasize on making sure your elevator pitch is clear and practiced, and that you can do it with a lot of confidence. That's something to think about.
Mhm. And so then just like, the practical application, because like, I mean, a lot of in this market or in general, right? Like we go and we network the shit out ourselves, right? Like in different, in person. I mean, I'm in New York, so it's easier for me, like in person,
Yeah.
online, otherwise, like tech. And like just try different messages, put them out, like see, because like how people perceive us and like what will be appreciated, it won't. Like, I mean, as I hear you, and it also my impression will depend a lot on the person and what like kind of like resonates. Like, do you recommend having different versions of this pitch, or just like kind of see whatever you feel the most confident about and just go with that and see where it lands?
Yeah, I would go with the confidence of it. I mean, every situation is also a little bit different. If you're in a little bit more informal, friendship, casual type of thing, you might, use a slightly different tactic than if you're in a serious networking or meeting someone that's going to make a decision to get you somewhere. Yeah, I think you have to use your judgment from that perspective.
Got it. Thank you.
There's a few more questions here that we might be able to cover in our next session. I'm not sure who asked these, but if you want to comment on them, John, how much follow-up is appropriate versus annoying? If more than once, how would you differentiate a second email
Yeah,
outreach?
yeah. It really depends on the company and the person, quite honest. I never took it personally when I had somebody following up. I think the thing you have to remember is after you leave from the interview, that person's got, probably a million different things that they're working on. I don't ever think it's intentional that a recruiter purposely waits or doesn't give you feedback. They're either waiting for someone to get back to them and they don't have an answer. It's awkward to say, I don't have an answer, I'm working on it, sorry, so many times. It should be, but it is hard for people to do that. You kind of have to gauge where it is. But Eric said, I think early on, you can minimize that a lot by saying, what's the process? How long do you think it's going to take? And can I follow up with you? Or when is appropriate for me to check in with you? Because I know you're very busy. You kind of take that mystery away of, do I send it? Is it annoying? Is this too much? It's really appropriate to talk about that when you're in the interview process and you leave. And you're also conveying that, listen, I don't want to be a pest, but I also you owe me at least some feedback or where I am, because it's not fair to me either. You're not saying that, but you're implying it when you sort of set the expectations of, what's next, how long, and when it would be good for me to check up with you. That would be one way, I think, to take that second guessing out as much as you can.
John, a question about HR and compliance. So, a lot of recruiters, I guess, what is HR's role with respect to guiding recruiters around compliance,
Yeah.
and how might that constrain what a recruiter might be able to share with you with respect to feedback as a job
Yeah.
seeker?
I mean, that one varies to a lot of degrees. I mean, I've always taken compliance as a common sense approach to it. live within the spirit of what you're trying, what the law is. And then some are just, listen, so afraid or so gun shy of doing anything wrong. It almost gets you to the point where it becomes a weird situation from that perspective. So, I've coached managers on, listen, compliance is like any other business risk. Do what's right, make the right decision, pick the right person, and let's minimize it as much as possible, but it can't dictate everything that you do. Having said that, I've met with a lot of other people that have said, listen, I'm not taking any risk on any kind of compliance issues. So that's some of at least what I've experienced on different companies and the way they handle compliance.
Yeah.
There was also some questions on, I think, the last call of, listen, am I overqualified or is it all based on my age? When you make that decision on what level you hire, and some of it's related to age, you also have to make that decision is this the right job? And this person, will they get bored? Will they come here for a year and then all of a sudden looking for a different job or look to get promoted? So, I don't believe that there's a lot of ageism out there. You can sort of, argue with me whether you think that's true or not, but sort of the dynamics in that is sort of trying to get the right balance of, am I getting the right fit? Because the worst thing that somebody wants from a recruiting standpoint is to hire someone, have them think they're going to get more responsibility or get more than what the job is, and they get bored, and leave within 6 months and a year, and I'm back to recruiting again. So that's, something to think about too. That's that balance of getting the right experience. You'd always love to get the best candidate. If you get too much skills, you have that dynamic of, could I have this problem in another 6 months to a year?
Yeah. Definitely the recruiter wants to make sure you stick around for a while. So they're trying to minimize risk. I think I talked about that last time. We're at the top of the hour, and I guess there's one last question. If you want to touch on this quickly, is there any good way to network remotely? I live in a rural area. Any quick thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, I mean, listen, networking is networking. If you can't get face to face, I mean, a lot of networking is through video calls and LinkedIn and, groups that are associated with it. I guess my advice is, a big part of networking becomes sort of, Zoom and all these other formats. So I'd focus on that as much as you can.
Yeah, there's a ton of Slack and WhatsApp communities now. Actually, nice segue, Liza. I've launched a Coffee with a Recruiter community in school. So you'll get a link to that. And in fact, I think I sent invites out already. Feel free to jump in there. That way we can have sort of a running thread. It's not meant to replace the Never Search Alone community, but it is aimed to be much more niche with respect to getting support about insight behind the scenes with respect to recruiting, interviewing, hiring, right? From people that have been on the inside, like John and myself. So anyway, I thought it could augment your experience and sort of your education and networking, the NSA experience. So I launched it, and we'll see how it goes. Would love any feedback from you guys in terms of what might be helpful. Feel free to send me a message or just post it in the community, and we'll go from there. And that's all I have for today, John. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your
You're welcome.
insights. And thank you
Yes.
everyone out there for engaging. And there's a ton of questions on the question board, and we'll touch on those next week. And we'll post up the recording here in the next day or so. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
John.
you, Jan.
Take care.